He's a professor of English at Bahrain University, former head of the English department, a prolific author and even more prolific tweeter on all manners of philosophical, political, and religious issues. He's also a good friend and a good friend of our communities. And we're very delighted that he's going to bring his Milton scholarship and his Jewish scholarship together in a presentation, which sounds really fascinating. I'm very delighted. Remember, it's already after 10 in Israel. Bill is joining us from Jerusalem, and which is why we put him on first. And I'm very delighted to invite Bill to make the first presentation. Thank you so much for joining us. Over to you. I'm going to mute myself.
Thank you.
Please remain muted. Yeah.
Yeah, Harvey, it is late here, but there's not much chance that I'll fall asleep during the talk since I'm the one giving the talk. Otherwise, it might be a question, but I think I'll be okay. So thank you for having me, and it's really exciting for me to have this medium. I mean, I use it very often when I'm teaching at Bar Ilan, but I see I won't be able to take the time to see all the friends that I know from Israel and from London and from America, but really thank you for having me. So the title of this talk is Fairy Tales and Theodicies. Harvey told me that I would need to explain what theodicy is, but I don't really think that's the case at Dunstan Road, but I'll do it anyway, just because the rabbi asked me to. So theodicy, many of you may know from reading Paradise Lost by John Milton. Milton describes his own poem as justifying the ways of God to man. And that's really pretty much become the dictionary definition of theodicy. Now, of course, theodicy exists as a genre because of the presence of evil and suffering in the world. And really that's what motivates Milton to write Paradise Lost, or one of the things that motivates him, is how does one justify the existence of God in the presence of evil and suffering? It's obviously a complicated issue, and it takes Milton 12 books to really maybe try to answer the question. There are many theodicies in the Western tradition. The Jewish tradition, of course, the theodicy that we all know is Job. In the Western tradition, you can go back and say maybe the Odyssey is a kind of theodicy. Why does it take Odysseus so long to get home? The Oresteia by Aeschylus in some ways is theodicy. Why is there all this interfamily violence and murder? So there are, in the Western tradition, there are theodicies. Milton is one of them. I'm thinking about theodicy because I'm teaching Milton, and I'm also living in a ultra-Orthodox neighborhood, a Haredi neighborhood during the time of COVID-19. And this period, I don't know what it's like in England. I assume it's not like it is here. This period has bred certain very simplistic kinds of theodicies. Why are we suffering? I saw two lately on the poster boards in my neighborhood. Does anybody want to guess why the Jewish people and the rest of the world are suffering from the plague of COVID-19? Anyone?
They're on mute.
Oh, they're on. Can they unmute themselves if they shout out? Can you do it?
Yes. If you would like to unmute yourself, if you have some comment, please do. Then mute yourself again afterwards.
Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe you don't know Jerusalem sociology as well as I do. I'm sure Harvey knows.
Because we sin.
Oh, good. Well, that's a good start. But the question is exactly what is the nature of the sin?
Occupation. Checked on mezuzahs.
Oh, well, somebody hasn't thought of making money out of that yet. No, this is actually much more of an existential threat to the Jewish people. So, of course, the first one is cell phones, which is kind of predictable, right? So the reason we're suffering, the whole world, is because we're using the wrong kind of communication device. And the other one is, that I saw in my neighborhood recently, is that women are not being makpid enough. They're not being diligent enough with their head covering. We're not even talking about modesty in general. We're talking about wigs. So that's what I would call really primitive and vulgar theodicy. And they fail really in two ways. They fail obviously because they're absurd and ridiculous. But even worse than that, it implies a kind of misunderstanding of what, Jewish life is about, what life is about, and what theodicy might entail. What we really have here is politicians taking the infinite and turning the infinite into a story that serves their purposes. So the question really is, what is the difference? Is there such a thing as the theodicy? And this is the question I'm really asking with my title. Is there such a thing as a theodicy which is not a fairy tale? Can we have a successful theodicy? So many people come up to me because I'm a Miltonist, or because some people think I'm a representative of religious people, and ask, well, why is COVID-19 happening? So they're really begging for a certain kind of answer. Really what I'm kind of suggesting, and this is really to anticipate where we'll be going, what I'm suggesting is if a theodicy succeeds, by definition, it will have to fail. For a theodicy to be effective, it will have to show its ineffectiveness in the face of the unknown. Nietzsche said, and we all know this, God is dead, but I think rather it's not that God is dead, but poetry is dead. That we've lost the ability not only to write, but essentially to read poetry, to read in such a way that we can accommodate complexity. And the people who are these authors of these simple theodicies, their primary aim is to make us not think. The story is over. I will narrate the story for you. And I think in many ways we should look at Jewish identity as a kind of self-narration. Through my engagement with the world, I think about my relationship to the world, my perspective, and its relationship to the world, to the relationship to God. In a sense, through that activity of reading and interpretation and writing, I'm writing my own story. And people who give these simple theodicies want to hand you your story. Here it is. You know what it is. You don't need to do anything else. So poetry, and today the theodicies I'm going to look at, I didn't mention Milton, so I feel I'm Yotze, but I want to look primarily at two theodicies, and they're both midrashim. One midrash is from Midrash Rabbah, Eicha Rabbah, and the other midrash is from an unexpected place, which is from the 20th century German author Thomas Mann, who wrote Joseph and His Brothers. And in some ways, Joseph and His Brothers is a form of midrash. And he, like Milton, more so than Milton, was very much learned in midrashim. And when one reads the very, very long Joseph and His Brothers, has anybody read it? I'm an English professor, and it's definitely the longest book I've ever read. It's almost 1,500 pages.
I've read it.
It's incredible, for me, just an incredible experience. And it is a midrash insofar that it is a commentary on this story for Mann in the Old Testament. And I think what's especially interesting about Mann and especially interesting about Milton is they are both interpretations, commentary, but commentary as poetry or narrative. In the case of Milton, it's epic. In the case of Mann, it's through the novel. And in that way, they have in common what we understand in Midrash. Our Midrash, is just that. It is commentary or interpretation, but as story, as narrative. So really my aim is to look at a famous midrash, and we'll look at it in a second. I'll just remind you of what it is for those of you who haven't looked at the sheet. The midrash is two stories, one with Rabbi Akiva, both with Rabbi Akiva and three sages. And in the first story, they hear the sound, that's what the Gemara says, they hear the sound, where they feel the presence of Rome from 120 mil away. And the sages start crying, and Rabbi Akiva says, why are you crying? The sages say, you see how the Romans are successful in the world and our temple is destroyed. Well, we have a reason to cry. And Rabbi Akiva, he laughs, he gives an explanation, and he says, well, if the Romans if they're being rewarded for all their sins, think about our reward in the future. That's the first story, less well known. The second one is the same group of people, and they are approaching Jerusalem, and they tear their clothing, they get closer to the Beit HaMikdash, and when they get close enough, they can see apparently from the Kadosh Kodashim, they can see from the Holy of Holies, a fox sneaking out from out of the ruins. Again, the sages cry. Rabbi Akiva says, why are you crying? The sages say, why are you laughing? And Rabbi Akiva gives an explanation. Yeah, that explanation we'll look at carefully, but the bottom line of the story is everything works out well in the end. And I think if you have seen that story, I've seen it a million times. And every time I look at it, I think this is a fairy tale theodicy. I mean, I didn't use those terms at the time, but I thought this is grossly unsatisfying because of the way it simplifies such a complicated issue. And I went back and looked at the Midrash, and I think it's safe to say, maybe Rabbi Belovsky can give me an amen on this, that if a Midrash seems to you to be clear and transparent in its meaning, if it doesn't appear to you to be opaque, then you don't understand, then you're not even halfway to understanding it. And there is something about Midrash that simultaneously presents itself as a fairy tale, which you can tell to your kids, and they'll get great pleasure out of it, and also which is subject to endless complexity and commentary.
You want me to comment? I agree.
You agree. Good. So
I agree.
Thank you for your participation, Rabbi Belovsky.
I'm going back on mute.
Okay. So I thought we would start with Thomas Mann, and I this is an unwieldy medium for participation. But if people do feel like they would like to participate, to weigh in, I don't know. There is a raise your hand function which you can find, or just blurt in, and we'll try to see how we can manage that. But I think we might be able to. So let's start. I'm going to now try to share my screen, which I am about to do successfully. Yes. False Tales and Theodicy. Does everybody see that?
Yeah, Bill, it's fine. It's working fine.
Yes.
Excellent.
Yes.
Good. So I said I would like to start with Mann. Now, Mann is truly a great midrashist because he not only steals from Chazal, but he also makes up his own midrashim. Of course he does. It's a 1,500-page book. But he makes up characters which are very compelling in his narrative. And when you think about it, it makes sense. It makes sense that a midrashist would add such a character. So here Joseph is in prison after he has been turned in by Potiphar. And Mann makes up this character of a prison warden, who is also a would-be novelist and a pharmacist. And here, Joseph, of course, gets along with everybody and is able to converse with everybody. And he engages the prison guard. This conversation is happening in the prison in a discussion about literature. You get a sense of just Mann's creative genius here that he's able to do that. And here, this prison guard gives his opinion about kinds of literature. There is undeniably a certain poetry in the literalness of such speech, the poetry of simplicity and fairy tales. So he's commenting on, I guess, the popular stories that are shared in a culture. There are, as I see it, two kinds of poetry, one born of the simplicity of the masses and one born of the spirit of the written word. The latter is indubitably the loftier, but in my opinion, it cannot exist except in friendly association with the former and requires its fertile ground, just as all the beauty of a higher life, even the splendor of Pharaoh himself, needs the topsoil of a vast indigenous population in order to flower above it and set the world in amazement. What a beautiful passage, really amazing, right? It's a Donald Woods translation. It's just incredible. So here, the prison guard, he makes a distinction between two kinds of poetry, the literal, and that's the fairy tale. And then he talks about what he calls the written. But I think we could just substitute for that is the commentary on the fairy tale. For Mann, the fairy tale that he's writing about, and I don't mean to offend anybody, and this is from Mann's perspective, the fairy tale that he's writing about is the story in Chumash. That's the fairy tale. And the commentary, and the fairy tale for Mann is for children, children's stories. It's the commentary which brings the story to life. It's the commentary which brings the story to life in all of its complexity, which leads to the higher life. Really, we can explain to our children that the world only comes into our horizon through interpretation. And we see why Torah Shabbal Peh is so significant in the Jewish tradition, because without Torah Shabbal Peh, you don't really have Torah Shebiksah. And without the oral law, not only and without the Midrash, you don't really have the story. That's what Man is saying, essentially. And in a way, you could, with major qualifications, say the same kind of thing about the Baalei Midrash, that their commentary makes the story live. You also see in this passage, what's really beautiful about it is Man does not denigrate the story that people tell to their children. This is the fertile topsoil, the vast fertile topsoil, without which nothing can flower. Meaning Man is not such an intellectual that he says we only want philosophy. Man says the best way of understanding things is through stories and interpretation. There's another great scene in Joseph and his brothers, where Joseph is rebuking his brothers, he's still in disguise, for, as he understands it, not taking sufficient care of their father. And he says to them, reproaching them, have you no learning? Have you no stories? Again, have you no learning? He reproaches his brothers. Have you no stories? Meaning for Man, the way that learning is accessible is through stories. We no longer live in a world, at least the world around us, that believes in that. If we want the truth, we don't look at stories, we look at spreadsheets, right? And I think part of maybe what COVID-19 allows us to do is to remember that there's a form of learning which goes beyond spreadsheets. There's more to heaven and earth than is dreamt of in your philosophy, my dear Horatio. There are things that go beyond Excel sheets. So that's, I think, what Man is saying. You get the higher life from poetry, from Midrash, but the stories, the fairy tales are still good. It's good if you're a kid. The problem is, and unfortunately this describes the sociological world we live in today, the problem is that we have adults who are still reading like children, which is a sad state of affairs, to have adults reading like children. So in the next passage from Man, here's another great innovation. So in Man's version of the story, Tamar, who will marry Judah, after that very long, complicated story, Tamar sits at Jacob's feet and hears the story of the Jewish people, or of the house of Jacob, of Jacob's family. And somehow, for Man, this serves as the background for her wanting to place herself within the story of this family, as Man sees it, to place herself within world history. It's amazing. It's a very interesting midrashic intervention. So here, Man is describing this interaction. This once upon a time was still very fresh, and Jacob's voice quavered as he spoke. He's speaking about recent history, whereas he had been relaxed in telling the grand epic of earlier and earliest onces, now covered by time, had worn an expression of solemn joy even for what was grim and heavy. For they were all God stories, and their telling was holy. Just a beautiful line. They're all God's stories, and their telling was holy. But it is quite certain it could not have been otherwise. And it must be noted that Tamar's listening soul was nourished on instruction by more than the once that lay covered beneath time and history, the holy once upon a time. Once is an unlimited word and has two faces. It looks back, far back, into sublimely dusky distances. And it looks ahead, far ahead, into distances no less sublime for being what is yet to come than those others are, having been. Some will deny this. For them, only the ones of the past are sublime, that of the future contemptible. They display piousness, not piety, are fools and gloomy souls. Jacob did not sit in their church. If to future ones one does not honor pay, one has to the ones of the past no further words to say. And likewise, one surely stands athwart the now of today. I guess Man is giving the sing-song that Jacob gave to Tamar so she could remember this. So there's simultaneously the once of the past, but also the once of the future. What could possibly be the once of the future?
Maybe there are new fairy tales to be told.
So I think I wouldn't use the term fairy tale here, but certainly there is that sense that things, that just as there is a once in the past that we speak about lovingly, there's a once of the future that somehow we anticipate. Let's just go back and look at that again. Once is an unlimited word and has two faces. It looks back, far back, into sublimely dusky distances, and it looks ahead, far ahead into the distances, no less sublime for being what is yet to come than those others are for having been. Tamar remarks that Jacob seems to spend more time on the once upon a time of the future than the once upon a time of the past. I think we'll come back to that, and it will make sense a little bit when we look at Rabbi Akiva. So here's the last page of the book. There are really no spoilers in Joseph and his brothers because you know how it ends, right? Here, the brothers are afraid after Jacob has died that Joseph will rebuke them, or even worse. So Joseph replies to them, "But dear brothers, dear old brothers," he replied, bowing to them with arms spread wide, "what are you saying? You speak exactly as if you feared me and wanted me to forgive you. Am I as God? In the land below it is said, I am as Paro, and though he is called God, he is but a dear, poor thing. From what perspective is Paro just a dear, poor thing? But in asking for my forgiveness, you have not, it appears, really understood the whole story we are in. I do not scold you for that. One can very easily be in a story without understanding it. Perhaps it was meant to be that way, and I have only myself to blame for always understanding too well the game that was played. For understanding too well the game that was played." Let's just skip down a little bit. "No," he said, "nothing of it, for he was also part of the game, of God's playful game." He's talking about Jacob now. "Under his protection, I had to rouse you by my brazen immaturity to do evil. But God indeed turned it to good so that I fed many people and matured a little myself besides. But if it is a question of pardon among us human beings, then I am the one who should beg it of you. For you had to play the evildoers so that everything might turn out this way. And now I am supposed to make use of Pharaoh's power merely because it is mine, to revenge myself on you for 3 days of chastisement in a well, and again turn to evil what God has turned to good? Don't make me laugh. For a man who, contrary to all justice and reason, uses power simply because he has it, one can only laugh at him." Favorite politicians? "If not today, then sometime in the future. And it is the future we shall hold to. Sleep in peace. Tomorrow, by God's counsel, we shall begin our journey back to the comical land of Egypt." Comical land of Egypt, strange, right? That is what he said to them, and they laughed and wept together. And they all reached their hands out to him as he stood there in their midst, and they touched him, and he caressed them as well. And so ends this invention of God, this beautiful story of Joseph and his brothers. They laughed and they wept. So now, of course, you want to read the whole book, I understand. And I do feel a little bit like I've just done a book report on Thomas Mann, and I have in a way, and it feels good. But now let's look at Eicha Rabbah, and this is the story that we started with. And I'm hoping that some of the things we discussed earlier in relationship to Mann will come home and help us here. So I'm going to read. I'm going to read in Hebrew and translate. I've always admired Rabbi Belovsky because I listened to his shiurim, and he is able so effortlessly and fluently to go from English to Hebrew. So you are used to a very high standard. I'm not going to live up to that standard. In fact, I might ask Rabbi Belovsky for a little help sometimes in just getting through mellifluously the Hebrew. So here's the stories. First one. V'kfar haya Rabbi Gamliel v'Rabbi Eliezer v'Rabbi Zariah v'Rabbi Yeshua v'Rabbi Akiva nichnasin l'Romi. So all these rabbis, they walked along the road to Rome. V'shamu kol hamonish al Romi, from this certain place, ad meil es v'esring mil. So they heard the sound of the multitudes of Rome. Some people describe it, or commentators say it's the commerce of Rome, that people feel even this far from the city. So the hustle and bustle of Rome is present throughout the empire. So they started to cry, the three other rabbis, and Rabbi Akiva laughed or smiled, misachik. Amru Akiva, anu bochim, va'ata misachik, we're crying and you're laughing. And he says, Amr lahem, lama bechita. It's interesting, in this version of the story, they have already stopped crying by the time that Rabbi Akiva reproaches them. Or maybe they stop when he does. Why were you crying? They still go on and explain. Armulo, lo nifcha shagoyim ovdim v'avodis chachavim. Shouldn't we be mourning? Shouldn't we be crying that the nations of the world are worshiping their gods? And they're worshiping their gods, and not only are they doing that, v'yoshvin behen b'shan and b'shalva, and they're dwelling in safety, in security, in peace. And our temple. Okay, thank you, Guy. And they're dwelling in peace, and our temple is destroyed. So you have, I think it's just important to remember that the Churban Beit HaMikdash is a trauma for the Jewish people, and this is really, in a way, what this story is about. How is it possible, or is it possible to go on in the face of trauma? And here the sages, and I have enormous reverence, inexpressible reverence for the sages, but I do treat them as if they're human here. And I think part of the humanity here is just the sense of desperate melancholy in the face of their own culture being destroyed and seeing the culture of Rome around them thriving. And there just is that sense of existential angst about that, and they can't help but cry. And Rabbi Akiva says to them, why are you laughing? Oh, it's that reason that I'm actually laughing. If the people who anger God are being rewarded in this way, then kol v'chomer l'oser ritzono. If the Gentiles of the world who bow to false idols, if they're being rewarded, then so will we. I think the implication of this answer is, and we might want to revise it, I think the implication of the answer is, here Rabbi Akiva is using a kol v'chomer, which is a kind of rational argument. I did not take logic in college, but I think it's from minor to major, from major to minor, right? I take a general thing and then I take the particular and I say if the general is true, then the particular is true, something like that. If the Romans who have committed so many bad deeds are being rewarded, then the Jewish people who do the goodwill of God will also be rewarded. Now, Rabbi Akiva is really mostly noted as a darshan, as a kind of poetic commentator. And here, the Rabbi Akiva of this story offers this rationalist explanation. Things may be bad now, he says to his friends, but they'll get better. Next story. Notably, in this story, there is no response of the sages. We'll see there is a response in the next story. Amar lahem. Oh, sorry, where are we? So here's the story. Pamacheret. Pamacheret hayu olim Yerushalayim. Higiu l'tzofim. They got to Har Tzofim. People have been to Jerusalem, know Har Tzofim. V'kara bigdehem. And they ripped their garments. Why do they rip their garments? Because in the site of the Beit HaMikdash, the law is that you rip your garments if you haven't been there, whatever, 30-day period. So in the sun of morning, they're ripping their garments. Higiu lahar habayit, v'ro shua. They saw a fox echad yotzim mibit kodesh kadoshim, and they saw a fox coming out of the kodesh kadoshim. Hitchiluhim bochim, and they started to cry. Rabbi Akiva masachik, and Rabbi Akiva started laughing. Amrulo, Akiva le'olam tamit me'alenu. You're always like freaking us out. You're always causing us to wonder. Anu bochim v'atam masachik. We're crying, and you're laughing. You're smiling. Amr lahem atem lama atem bochim. It's here like there's a reproach in the answer in that double atem. Atem lama atem bochim. Amruloi. And here he gives the pasuk that says anybody, a foreigner who approaches the Holy of Holies will die. And here we're seeing a fox coming out of the ruins. How can we be anything but depressed? And even worse, v'alabnit kayam pasuk al har Sion sheshamim shoalim halchubo. This is the pasuk from Eicha that this portion of the Midrash starts with. The sages say, you see the fox coming out? The prophecy has been fulfilled. There was the prophecy that foxes would roam in the Beit HaMikdash, and the sages say with great melancholy, you see that God's will has been fulfilled, and the fulfillment has ended in destruction. Now, all the commentators again will ask, well, surely the sages believed in the prophecy that Rabbi Akiva is about to give, and the answer is yes, but I still think the Midrash is representing this sense of desperation, this sense of, even though we know the prophecy one day will come true, our reality is created by that ripping of the garments, of that sense of mourning. Now, how does Rabbi Akiva answer? Amar lehem, af ani kach lekach ani misachek, hari hu oimer, vehi heideli edim nemoni. This is the prophet Isaiah speaking, and I will take to me faithful witnesses, reliable witnesses, et Uriah HaKohen vet Zechariah ben Yevarchehu. So these are two prophets. One is Uriah, who is nowhere mentioned in the prophetic books, or is mentioned but does not have a prophetic book after his own name. He's mentioned apparently in Micha and also in Yirmiyahu. And then the other prophet is Zechariah. And then Rabbi Akiva asks, he asks a question basically on himself. Like, so the prophet says, I've got two eidim. Some people say it's the prophet, some people say it's God. Either way it works. I've got two eidim. Rabbi Akiva first asks, Ma inyan Uriah etzel Zechariah? What's the relationship between Uriah and Zechariah? Uriah b'mikdash rishon v'Zechariah b'mikdash sheni. Uriah, he was a prophet before the fall of the first temple, and Zechariah was a prophet after the fall of the second temple. Elama amar Uriah, and he goes on, and the pasuk is Komar Hashem tzvot Sion sadet ticharish v'Yushalayim iyim tiyeh, and the God of hosts will render Zion, will plow down Zion, and it will be like ruins, and that's the despairing prophecy of Uriah. Umamar Zechariah. Od Yeshu Zakenim v'Zakeno b'Rechovos Yerushalayim v'ish mishanto b'yado mirov yomim. The older men and older women will be dancing in the streets of Jerusalem. They'll have sticks in their hand just to show how old they are, and yet they're still dancing. V'ksiv basrai, and it says afterwards, v'Rechovo ta'ir yamala yaladim v'yalados misachkim b'Rechovoseha. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, hari li shnei edim elu. Im kaimim divrei Uriah. So God says, I have these two eidim. If the prophecy of Uriah is fulfilled, then the prophecy of Zechariah will also be fulfilled. If one is rendered nullified, the other will be rendered nullified. And Akiva goes on and says, "V'samachti shniskaimu divrei Uriah, ulesof divrei Zechariah, asidin lehiskayim." I rejoiced because the prophecy of Uriah was fulfilled, and in the end, it means that the prophecy of Zechariah will be fulfilled. How is Rabbi Akiva answering the sages? Interesting, in this story, the end of the story, in the way it's rendered in Makot, is, you have consoled us, Akiva, you have consoled us, Akiva. Twice, it's doubled. And that may suggest that the answer that Rabbi Akiva gives in this second story somehow is enough to satisfy the sages on the first story as well. But first of all, how is Rabbi Akiva trying to cheer the sages up?
Is quoting basically from the parashot and the Tanakh. It's quoting the prophecies, is trying to align them with the reality of his time.
It's interesting because the sages bring a prophecy and they say it's fulfilled. And Rabbi Akiva now he brings, it's really, I very rarely use the word intertextual because I really don't like it, but it kind of calls out for it here because there's so many psukim. There's Zechariah, there's Uriah who's present in Yirmiyahu, but is quoted in the story from Micha. There's Rabbi Akiva is almost piling on the prophetic tradition and saying, well, you have your prophecy that was fulfilled, but what about these? What about all of these prophecies? And the truth is these prophecies are ambivalent, and the ones I just mentioned are even negative. But how does, what I'm just asking a simple reading. When Rabbi Akiva says, when he brings the two sets of psukim, one is, well, I guess one answer is, when I see the fox in the ruins, I know we've hit rock bottom. And by knowing we've hit rock bottom, I know that the next prophecy will be fulfilled. That is, Rabbi Akiva says, now the prophecy of Uriah has finally been fulfilled. And because it's fulfilled, because Klal Yisrael has been diminished and pushed down, so now we're ready for the other prophecy to come into existence. I think that's one reading. Anybody else have any suggestions or ideas? Yeah, Brian, if you're raising your hand, or if that's just your head.
If you want to ask, you need to unmute yourself.
Oh, is anybody unmuting themselves? No. Please feel free if you want to. So there are two visions. And I think Rabbi Akiva is saying, one vision really will make us weep and cry. One vision will make us laugh. When I look at the world, I can see things from either one of those perspectives. One of the commentators on this midrash says that the edut of Uriah and of Zechariah, they're one edus. That is, they're one testimony. How can they be one testimony? They're contradictory. Because we live in a world where the fox is both the sign of the ultimate diminution of the people of Israel, but also the sign of the possibility of a future. That in that one, so Rabbi Akiva is essentially saying to the sages, you don't know how to read. You're not reading properly. There is more to what you see than what you think is there. Remember, Rabbi Akiva is the one who goes into the Pardes, where all the other sages, they go crazy or they die. Rabbi Akiva goes into this place of secrets and he exits this place of secrets. Rabbi Akiva says, if you look past the simple meaning, you'll see another meaning behind it. And it's not just like in the first story. In the first story, the sages say, things are really bad now. And in a way, Rabbi Akiva says, yeah, they're bad now, but they'll get better. The reason that the sages are comforted from both stories is that by the time they see how Rabbi Akiva reads this story, they understand the first story better. They understand not just that it's really bad now and it will get better, but even in the bad, there's already the possibility for the good. That the two prophecies, the prophecies that lead to celebration, fecundity, dancing, that's always present, just as that other narrative is also always present. It's kind of, I'm hoping you'll see a little bit why we started with...
But presumably this is just the same as the end of your Joseph story, in that Rabbi Akiva believes in destiny, and therefore he sees all these things as being a continuous plot where we are merely actors, but the roles are predestined. And
remember, go ahead, yeah.
If Joseph explains to his brothers that, they shouldn't be depressed about doing bad things because it was all part of a story that was required for the good things to come. And presumably, the view is that Rabbi Akiva sees the world in exactly the same way. That
well, wait. You're going a little. So I think the not knowing. I think for Rabbi Akiva, it's true. Joseph says, "Yeah, I knew the game all along," and that's why he laughs. And Joseph's laughter in Man, in some ways, is echoing Rabbi Akiva's laughter. He knows the game. By meaning he knows the game is he knows the prophetic frameworks, both of them. And yes, it's true that we know how the story is going to end, but we don't know exactly what our part is. And for Joseph says to his brothers, because again, go back to bad and good theodicies. Bad theodicies tells you, it says, this is what it means. In the end, Rabbi Akiva is really saying, we have no idea what this means now. It can mean many different things. Rabbi Akiva ends in responsibility. You must read. This is not it starts out as being a fairy tale, right? There's a happy ending. And I think you're just suggesting that that's how, I don't think that's how Man sees his own story, or how Joseph, or how Chazal, how the sages see the story of Rabbi Akiva. Remember at the end of Joseph and his brothers, they wept and they laughed, or they laughed and they wept. They laugh and they weep at the same time, because the world is never that simple story that politicians who are dressed up as theologians like to tell us. Because politicians are very, very far away from poetry. It's true that Rabbi Akiva gives the version of the fairy tale for kids, but kids who don't graduate to adult reading, well, they become politicians maybe, but they never get to the point where they're able to accommodate really the mystery. And although in a way we have a sense of an ending, we know where the ending is, we still live in that existential present. Remember, Rabbi Akiva, he's one of the people who rips his garments. Meaning, even though he laughs, what does he do? What does he do behaviorally? He mourns. You see kind of the complexity of the story right there. You forget by the end of the story that Rabbi Akiva is there with this ripped garment. So God's not dead. And when people ask, why is this happening? And they want you to answer, it's almost, there are two kinds of people who ask that question. One are very religious people. Why is this happening? Please tell me. And the other are secular people, atheists. Why is this happening? And both of them are begging for a simple answer. And a good theodicy will say, make yourself part of the story. Thank you, Rabbi Belevsky. I think that's my 40 minutes, right? Is Rabbi Belevsky still here?
So I'm just unmuting myself. Yes, Bill, if you're completed with the text, could you take it off screen share for a moment?
I am now going to do that, Rabbi Belevsky. I'm going to just, okay. I'm really not as bad at this. I do this every week with my students. Oh, here it is. Okay, stop share.
Oh,
yes, and we're all here. Sorry.
Well done.
So thank you for being attentive.
So I'm sure join me in thanking Bill very much for a fascinating, engaging, and most unusual presentation, and for joining us.
Is unusual? Is that, tell me, people, is that a compliment from Rabbi Belevsky?
Yes, it's a compliment. Yes, it's a compliment. I want to say, if we need to converse about this privately, we can do it tomorrow.
Okay. Thank you very much. Good.
Thank you so much. Remember, it's already quite late in Israel. We're extremely delighted that Bill's been able to join us again. It's the 5th or 6th time he's presented for us at Dunstan Road. And the virtual presentation, nothing has been diminished by seeing them at a distance. And thank you for preparing the text, showing them in this way. And thank you for everyone who joined us for the first session. There's going to be